welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. This is part 2 of a series about the murder of a young woman named Piang who was a domestic helper in Singapore. She was originally from Myanmar, and the family that she ended up working with were horribly cruel and abusive to her. Not just one family member, but 3 of them. They were starving her, beating her, torturing her, and eventually they murdered her. So part 1 covered Piang's background, her childhood, and how she came to Singapore, and how she was treated by this family, and her actual murder. So this part will cover the arrests, the aftermath, and the trial of Gaiyathiri Murugayan, who was one of her abusers. If you have not seen part 1, I will put a link somewhere where you can easily find it. Please go watch that first, otherwise this will not make sense at all. And also, if you have been watching my videos and enjoying them, please subscribe, and that way you won't miss any of them in the future. I do need to make one correction about something I said in part 1. I stated that Gaiyathiri tied Piang to the window grill in the kitchen and forced her to sleep on the kitchen floor. That is not correct. She actually tied her to the bedroom window grill and forced her to sleep on the floor in the bedroom. And I will tell you more about why that is later. Sorry about that. I strive for perfect detail in my videos, and this just confused me a little bit, and I guess I just missed it. So, after Piang was pronounced dead, Gaiyathiri and Prima were both arrested that afternoon. They were both charged with first-degree murder, which is a capital offense in Singapore. Singapore does have the death penalty, and so that means that if convicted, they would be sentenced to death by hanging. When this happened, the neighbors were absolutely shocked. Several of them said that nothing seemed amiss that night, they didn't hear anything. They recalled Piang being a polite girl. They said that they rarely saw her unless she was outside cleaning the windows or hanging the laundry. And one of them recalled that she did look thin, which, as a reminder, by the time she was murdered, Piang weighed only 53 pounds. She was being starved to death. Meanwhile, Piang's older brother came from Myanmar to retrieve Piang's body and bring her home. Piang's brother was a farmer, and he also volunteered with the Catholic Church. Some non-governmental organizations came up with some money to get him to Singapore. Speaking of money, the Singaporeans actually were pretty generous. They donated a total of 30,000 Singapore dollars, which is about 21,000 American dollars at the time that this happened, like immediately. And the embassy for Myanmar in Singapore started working with Myanmar authorities to keep this money safe for Piang's son in the future. Because remember, he's only 3 years old. Of course, Piang's brother said that the sight of her body and being with her body on the long journey home made him feel very distraught. But he was extremely grateful for the kindness and love shown by the Singaporeans, as well as the welfare organizations and churches that helped him. He eventually got her body home, and he buried her next to their parents in their village, which was called Dempsey Village. Here's a quote from him. "I'm recording everything that Piang's son needs to know about his mother. I will teach her son to forgive and be kind to others, and not to repay evil with evil." I just want to reflect on this for a moment. That quote just really struck me, because you have this person who just found out that their little sister was murdered in a foreign country, a country he was probably never planning on visiting. And he goes to retrieve her body. It's this horribly stressful situation for him. He's very uncomfortable, probably. And that's one of the first things he says to the media, that he's going to teach Piang's son forgiveness. That's pretty extraordinary to me. He also put a cross up near their house that has Piang's name and her birth and death dates. So the next month in August, the husband, Kevin Chelvam, was arrested, and he was charged with voluntarily causing grievous harm to Piang. And also, if you recall, he was a police officer. So he was also going to go through police hearings because this represented his conduct while he was on duty, which of course was not acceptable in the police force. So initially, Kevin told the police that there were CCTV cameras in the house, but he said that he had turned them off 6 months earlier at the request of the two Chinese tenants who were living in their flat. But the police found these tapes, and when they played them, they saw that they had been recording right up until and through Piang's murder. All of this was caught on camera, and I don't think these tapes have ever been shown to the public, but of course they were played in court, which we'll get to. By the way, the two tenants were not charged with anything. Now, Gayatri and her mother Prema were both remanded to prison to undergo psychiatric evaluations, and these evaluations took 4 years to complete. That seems like a really long time. This was before COVID, so it wasn't affected by the pandemic. I'm not sure if that's normal or why it took so long, but it took 4 years. The psychiatrist found that Gayatri had two major psychiatric disorders, which were OCD, which made her totally obsessed with cleanliness, and which had been present for some time even before Piang arrived at her home. And she also had postpartum depression after the birth of her son. And remember, her son was just a baby. He was a few months old when Piang got there. So Gayatri still would have been in the midst of this. So after the court heard about these two psychiatric issues, they reduced her charge to first-degree culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So that meant that Gayatri was no longer eligible for the death penalty. The maximum penalty for that charge would actually be life in prison and caning, or a fine. Now, I did want to mention caning because it's something that people hear a lot about Singapore, and there are some misconceptions about it, so I just want to clear those up. So first of all, if you don't know what caning is, feel free to Google it. It's pretty gruesome, so you may not want to. In Singapore, they don't actually cane women at all in Singapore. They only cane men, and men can be caned for a variety of offenses. Caning in Singapore became kind of notorious internationally in the mid-1990s because an American teenager, whose name was Michael Fay, was sentenced to 6 strokes of the cane in 1994. Michael Fay was a kid from St. Louis. He had mostly grown up there, but he had moved to Singapore at some point because his mother and stepfather lived there. And so he was in school in Singapore when this happened, and he was convicted of vandalizing cars and stealing road signs. But he maintains that he didn't vandalize any cars. Of course, this sentence was really shocking to Americans, and the president at the time, Bill Clinton, along with 24 senators, wrote a letter to the government of Singapore asking them for leniency. And in response to that, they did reduce his sentence from 6 strokes to 4 strokes, and they did actually carry this out on May 5th, 1994. This was extremely controversial in the US. So part of the public was just shocked that Singapore would do this. They found it very barbaric. How could a civilized nation cane people as a punishment? And then there were also some Americans who were like, oh, that sounds great. Maybe we should do that here too. I can't even believe this, but there was actually a poll done in the United States in which 60% of respondents favored this type of harsh sentencing for a crime. I don't know who did this poll or who they asked or how people would respond to that today. I have no idea. There was also talk in the media about how caning represented, quote, Asian values. But in fact, this was left over from the British. This was a punishment used by the British in Singapore, instituted by them, and they just kept it when they became their own country. Also, there is this myth that if you chew gum in Singapore, that can get you caned, and that is not true. This caning thing is actually irrelevant to this story because, like I said, they don't cane women, and both Gayatri and Prema were women and were not going to get caned anyway, but I just wanted to clarify a few things about it. Gayathri's trial, so she was the first one to be tried. It started on February 23rd, 2021, so almost 5 years after Piang was murdered. She pleaded guilty to the charge of culpable homicide and 27 other charges. These charges were all based on video evidence that the police had obtained from those CCTV cameras, and I believe the footage went back like 35 days. In court, a more detailed play-by-play of exactly what happened that night came out, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you what it is. Just as a warning, this part is really specific. It's very disturbing, so if you don't want to hear about exactly what happened the night Piang was murdered, just skip ahead like a minute or two. So supposedly, sometime before the night that this happened, Piang had put some of the children's toys in the sofa, like she stuffed them between the sofa cushions instead of putting them back in their proper place. And Gayatri figured this out, and it made her extremely angry. She interpreted it as Piang being purposely defiant. So if you remember from part 1, Gayatri had accused Piang of stealing food from the fridge, even though she was being starved. Well, as you can imagine, Piang got really desperate for food, and she had started rummaging around in their trash to try to find something to eat. And this totally freaked out Gayatri with her OCD and cleanliness issues, and that's why she started tying Piang up at night so that she wouldn't look for food in the trash can. So evidently, the night of Piang's murder, Piang was trying to do laundry around 11:40 p.m. Now remember, she had been up since 5 a.m. Gayatri would only let Piang sleep 5 hours a night, so I guess she was just trying to get some laundry in before she went to bed. I just don't understand this. You know, she's been up since 5 a.m. Do you really have to do laundry that late? What is so important about the laundry? I don't get it. But anyway, Gayatri felt that Piang was moving too slowly. So of course, Gayatri, in her usual manner, starts punching Piang in the neck and also grabbing her by her hair because she was doing the laundry too slowly, like after having been awake for 19 hours while she was starving. Piang was so weak at this point from all of the abuse that she'd gotten as well as the starvation that these punches from Gayatri really messed with her, and she basically became disoriented. So she tried to go in the bathroom, and she was kind of swaying, as you can imagine, being disoriented. And Gayatri tells her to stop dancing and hit her in the head with the laundry detergent bottle. And again, Piang was so weak that this actually knocked her out right onto the floor. Her legs went out from under her, and she couldn't even get back up. Don't forget, too, that Piang has been sleep deprived for over a year because of Gayatri having her work 7 days a week and only letting her sleep for 5 hours. That's just insane. I just can't even believe... I can't believe any of this, but that's just insane. So I don't know why these people feel like violence is the answer to these issues, if you want to even call them that. But with Piang lying on the floor, knocked out, Gayatri calls Prima over, and they both start kicking her for 15 minutes. Actually, it says they assaulted her, so I'm not sure exactly what that means during the 15 minutes, but they were, of course, doing something horrible to Piang that they had no business doing. Then, as they love to do, they poured cold water all over Piang again. Prima demanded that Piang go change her clothes from the wet ones into some dry ones, but Piang was too weak to get up and do this. So Prima, Gayathri's mother, dragged Piang across the kitchen floor and into the bedroom, where she kicked her in the stomach, punched her in the neck, and started strangling her. And then at some point, Gayatri came in the bedroom, and Piang asked for some food. Gayatri said no. Instead, she tied her up, punched her in the stomach, and left her there, in her wet clothes. Then Gayatri comes in again right after midnight and kicks Piang again and tells her she'd better be up at 5 a.m. when the alarm goes off. All of this is insane. There is no excuse for how Gayatri, Prima, and Kevin all treated Piang at all. However, I'm just imagining this situation. You know, you've got these 3 adults living together in an apartment, and they have 2 renters, so that's 5 adults. They have 2 little kids. And then you've got Gayatri with her OCD and her postpartum depression, and you bring in Piang, and of course, all of these people are going to take their stress out on Piang because she's vulnerable. She has no one protecting her. She's tiny. I believe she only weighed like 85 pounds when she got to Singapore. And she was just, unfortunately, their punching bag. And I just can't understand, like, what was going on in the generations of this family that led to them thinking that it was okay to do this, you should do this, or it'll help. I just can't imagine. So then 5 a.m. rolls around, just 5 hours later, actually a little less than that. Gayatri goes right back to assaulting Piang, and that's when she starts to choke her, and the other stuff that I described in part 1 happens. I am actually not clear on whether Piang died around midnight or around 5 a.m. or sometime in the middle of the night. But either way, it's horrific, it's unimaginable, and unfathomable. They could do this to anyone. Even a small fraction of this is just evil. This is just pure evil. So back to Gayathri's trial. The prosecutor, whose name was Muhammad Faisal Mohammed Abdul Qadir, said this: "This is a case where, simply put, words fail us. That one human being would treat another in this evil and utterly inhumane manner is cause for the righteous anger of the court." So Gayatri had 2 defense attorneys, and of course their best shot here was to go with Gayathri's 2 diagnosed psychiatric issues. So the prosecution was aiming for life in prison, and the defense was aiming for 14 years in prison for Gayatri. They talked about how Gayatri was absolutely obsessed with cleanliness. She would clean the apartment in an excessive way every single day. That's what it says, even though she's had domestic helpers, so I just can't imagine how much cleaning was going on there, but it sounds like a whole lot. She would also ask all family members who came over to wear face masks, and this was before COVID. One time, she supposedly found some of her sister-in-law's hair on the floor, and from then on, she asked her sister-in-law to wear a shower cap every time she came over. Apparently, Gayathri's children had just some normal childhood illnesses that happened to virtually every kid, and she blamed these on a lack of cleanliness. And so I guess in her mind, she was just freaking out about her children, and she was making the connection that somehow Piang was unhygienic, and that was just fueling her rage. One doctor testified that due to her postpartum depression, Gayatri probably wasn't sleeping well, and that probably gave her a short fuse, which made her really angry at Piang. And they also argued that because Gayatri had terminated a pregnancy in 2016, that somehow also made her more prone to anger. So then there was some drama at the end of the trial with Gayatri trying to get as few years in prison as she could. Now, she had pled guilty, but she was supposed to be sentenced on April 29th, 2021, but she managed to get that moved because she said that she might retract her guilty plea. After all of this, through this whole trial and all this video evidence and this years-long investigation, I think I forgot to mention that the investigation itself, just like the psychiatric evaluations, just took a really long time. And the officials investigating even tried to go back and find out who in Myanmar even changed her birth date on her passport, but they never found that person. So anyway, Gayatri got a new attorney. She fired her other 2 attorneys. The new attorney asked for more time, and her new attorney tried to argue that she should be charged with second-degree culpable homicide, which would mean that she didn't mean to kill Piang. And the maximum sentence for this charge would have been 15 years instead of life. But the prosecution was like, no, we are not backing down from this charge. Plus, of course, Gayatri had already pled guilty anyway. She also asked that her name be withheld from the media to protect her children, which I can kind of understand, but first of all, she'd already been in the media for years. I mean, this had happened 5 years before. Everyone in Singapore and many people around the world already knew about this. And also, the judge wrote that there was no precedence for that, so they said no. And so 2 months after she was supposed to be sentenced originally, on June 22nd, 2021, Gaiyathiri Murugayan was sentenced to 30 years in prison, which had been reduced due to her psychiatric issues. This is the longest sentence that has ever been handed down for killing a domestic worker, and yes, that does mean that it has happened before in Singapore and, of course, in other countries. The judge in this case was Judge Si Ki-un, and I actually read almost his whole opinion, and it's extremely well written, so I just want to read you a little bit of it. He said that this case was undoubtedly among the worst cases of culpable homicide imaginable. That Gayatri showed Piang absolutely no mercy, and that also Gayatri had no remorse at all. He said that despite Gayatri having multiple mental illnesses, she knew what she was doing because, remember, she lied to the doctor. So all of this was kind of planned out in her mind. So since she's been in prison, Gayatri has complained that the state has not been providing her with medical care and that she has been physically and sexually abused by other inmates. So officials looked into this, and it turned out that, yes, there actually were 2 instances of sexual abuse involving Gayatri, but she was actually the aggressor. Shocker. This is really funny. So Gayatri actually tried to say that she had been WhatsApping with Piang's family from prison, and that they had forgiven her. This was her rationale to get out of prison. Guess what? She didn't have a phone in prison, so that's not even possible. And of course, she tried to appeal, and that was rejected. Prima actually got her charge dropped, which is kind of shocking. I kind of wish that hadn't happened, because it certainly sounds like Prima was just as guilty as Gayatri. But she got a discharge not amounting to acquittal, which means that if they find any new evidence, that she can still be tried. But unless they come up with more evidence beyond the 35 days of continuous CCTV footage that they have, it sounds like Prima is going to get away with this completely scot-free. Gayatri and Kevin got divorced in 2020, and Kevin is still awaiting trial. He has 5 charges pending against him, but they're not for murder, they're for hurting Piang. He theoretically could get up to 22 years in prison, I think, plus caning and/or a fine, but it remains to be seen what will happen with him. The Ministry of Manpower gave Piang's family a full insurance payment, which included her full death benefit, her repatriation cost, and a special gratuity payment. They did implement some changes in their system to try to protect helpers more after Piang's death. So one of the things they did was they started doing random checks in households with a helper. These random visits have like a built-in way for the officials to submit a police report right then and there if they suspect something is wrong. One of the first things they found when they started doing these random checks was that employers were illegally taking helpers' passports away and not letting them have them, which of course is a crazy level of control because now the helper can't leave the country. This is a common thing around the world, by the way. They also implemented mandatory days off. I think they took away the thing where you could trade your day off for compensation. I'm not totally sure on that, though. And they added some things to the medical checkups that they were already doing. And they also made it easier to file a police report during the checkup, too, so that the doctor can make a report if something seems off. So there's another organization in the government called the Center for Domestic Employees. I'm not sure if that's part of the Ministry of Manpower or if it's a totally separate branch, but they started interviewing 2,000 maids a month. And here's a quote from the director of that organization about what they've found in these interviews. Common areas of concern raised by a small number of migrant domestic workers include insufficient rest and food, having their personal documents such as passports, work permits, and contract being withheld from them, unsafe work environment, or illegal deployment and salary issues. These cases are reported to the Ministry of Manpower for further investigation. So the Ministry of Manpower puts out this documentation about suggested ways to treat your domestic helper, but really the employer still has a lot of control over what actually happens. So there are advocacy groups for the domestic helpers, and what they would really like for the government to do is to put more rules in place about exactly how much sleep they should get and how much food they should get. There is a section in the kind of like guidebook to having a domestic helper that talks about how much food a helper should get. I believe it's like they're entitled to something in the morning and then a palm-sized piece of meat with rice and vegetables for both lunch and dinner. But again, that's just a suggestion. It's just a guideline. And these advocacy groups would really like for the Ministry of Manpower to make those actual rules that they would check for during these random checks. After the story came out, Singaporeans actually kept donating money to Piang's son's education fund, and they raised over 144,000 US dollars for him. He's being raised by Piang's older sister still, and there's actually a documentary from Al Jazeera's 101 East. It's called Made in Singapore. Now, originally, this documentary was just about domestic workers in Singapore in general and kind of all the stuff that they go through, but Piang's death happened right before they started filming, and so they actually went all the way to Dempsey Village, where Piang was from, and interviewed her family members and the other people from the village. And of course, all of these people were totally distraught and mourning Piang. I mean, Piang was a precious daughter of this village, and I guarantee you that all of those people still think about her and still miss her today. So like I said earlier, this is not the first time that a domestic helper has been murdered in Singapore. This whole industry, if you want to call it that, is just plagued with all kinds of problems for the helpers. There's a report from Human Rights Watch released in 2005 that talks about a lot of issues faced by domestic helpers in Singapore. And in all fairness, I know that this is almost 20 years old, and there was an official from the Ministry of Manpower, I think, who said that in the 12 years he had been there, living conditions for the helpers had improved dramatically. But I think it's helpful to just look at the history of this. Between 1999 and 2005, at least 147 migrant domestic workers died from workplace accidents or suicide, most by jumping or falling from residential buildings. Isolation at the workplace, excessive work demands, employer abuse, and financial pressures are all factors that may contribute to anxiety and depression. Human Rights Watch interviewed a domestic worker who had attempted suicide after suffering poor working conditions and feeling that she had no alternatives for escape. She said, "I was afraid that if I ran away, I would be caught by the police. Madam often got angry with me, complained to the agency, and the agency got angry with me. The agent asked, 'What do you want?' I said, 'I want to die, ma'am, because the people here are cruel. Everything I do is wrong, and I'm always called an idiot and stupid. It got so bad I really didn't know what to do, so I drank poison for rats and cockroaches. I lost consciousness, and Madam brought me to the hospital. The police told me it was wrong to try suicide. When the incident happened, I had been working exactly 7 months. I had earned 53 US dollars. Hazardous workplace conditions include being forced to clean the outside of windows from precarious ledges or to hang wet clothes from bamboo poles out of high windows from unsafe positions. An official from the Sri Lanka High Commission described one case in which a domestic worker was injured but did not die. One girl fell over about 3 years ago. She stood on the kitchen ledge. She slipped and fell 4 floors. Employers scream if windows are not shining. She was in the hospital for 2 months. This is still going on, and I know that because I found many articles describing how workers fell from high windows or ledges from 2015, 2017, 2018, 19, 2021. And actually, the situation for helpers from Myanmar was so bad that in 2014, the government actually stopped them from going to Singapore for that reason. It was just too dangerous. But of course, there's always a way to get around it, and today there are thousands of helpers from Myanmar living in Singapore. I found this website about maid insurance in Singapore, and it says this: given the number of domestic helpers balancing precariously on ledges as they clean their employers' windows, it's a good thing maid insurance includes hospitalization benefits and surgical expenses. In the event that your domestic helper falls sick, gets injured, or lands in the hospital, you can make a claim for the medical bills. Now, I'm not an architect, but I'm willing to bet there's some way that this could be made safer in the building design itself. So not only have there been all of these horror stories with helpers getting abused and killed, but sometimes they actually abuse or kill their employers. That has happened a couple of times. Also, I watched a video on YouTube where this person starts following a worker on TikTok, I think, and the person is able to figure out exactly which apartment the helper lives in. And so the whole argument is this is a security concern, because if your helper posts something indicating that you're not home, then, well, somebody could come break into your apartment more easily. And of course, I do understand that. There definitely are safety concerns about that. But what really struck me in the video was there just seemed to be a lack of understanding why a helper would want to have a phone. Like, the whole argument seemed to be that they shouldn't have a phone. And I just cannot imagine in this day and age not letting someone have a phone. I mean, I realize that a smartphone is not a basic need like food, shelter, or clothing, or water. But it's kind of essential for these people because they need it to talk to their families, they need it to, meet up with friends and try to get out of the house once in a while. And some of them also use it for fun, like they make fun videos of themselves cleaning. It just kind of adds some happiness to their day, which is probably otherwise not that great. And I was just really shocked because a lot of the comments were like, if the person wants to have a cell phone, well, that's against the employer contract, so they should go find another job. But most of these people are just so young. They're these young women who have very limited life experience. They're not necessarily going to realize how necessary their phone is for their sanity, or know how to negotiate, so it just seems kind of unfair. I mean, of course, employers should have a conversation about safety and security risk with their helpers, and I totally understand that, but totally taking the phone away just seems excessively cruel. I think the best thing that came out of this case was that the next year, in 2017, Singapore started piloting a totally new program that actually gave helpers their own apartment, so they were no longer having to live with a family, and they started working part-time. So I believe they usually work something like 8:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. with a 2-hour break. And 97% of the helpers who participated in this program preferred having their own apartment to living with a family. 80% said that they were happy to completely relax after work, and that they were glad they didn't have this pressure to kind of look busy. They also get a subsidy for both transport and their apartment, and they make 50% more money this way. This seems like such a humane alternative to having to live in your employer's apartment with them. And I'm not sure if the program is still going on. I certainly hope so. I hope that this is a trend that continues and becomes the norm. It's just so sad that in her very short life, her 24 years, Piang knew so much tragedy and loss and abuse. I mean, where was the silver lining in her life? I'm sure it was her little son, but she had to leave him behind when she went to Singapore. She was really incredibly unlucky, and that's just a level of misfortune that no human being should have to endure. I really hope that her son can have a better life and that this money is managed properly for him. My whole heart is with him, and I hope he's doing okay. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot to me to have people watch my videos. I started doing this because I watch a lot of true crime on YouTube and through other content providers, and I noticed that the same cases were coming up over and over, and those are mostly cases from the US and the UK. And I'm glad that those cases got a lot of coverage. That's good. But there are so many other cases around the world that really deserve to be told in full. They really deserve someone researching them and putting a video together so that people in the future can learn about them. You know, often there's a Wikipedia article and there are news articles, but there's not necessarily a big long write up, so that's kind of the purpose of my channel. I believe that all victims deserve to have their story told in a respectful way so that they are honored and not forgotten. So, thank you for being on this journey with me. I really appreciate it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching again, and I will see you next time.